Chapter 2. First Principles. Before attempting to state what mental healing is, it may be well to have a clear understanding of what it is not. First, then, it is not a religion. There is no more religion in healing the sick by mental processes than there is in healing them by pills or clysters. Many good people think otherwise, and cite the example of the Master. But there is no evidence that he regarded the act of healing as a religious rite, except in so far as all benevolent acts belong to that scheme of universal altruism which was the essence of his religion. But he exacted no precedent conditions of religious belief from the beneficiaries of his power. He prescribed for them no acts of religious worship, nor did he himself perform any in connection with the exercise of his healing power. The only thing that savored of religion, therefore, was in that which he refrained from doing, namely, he accepted no fees for his services, nor did he charge his apostles for lessons. Secondly, there is nothing supernatural or supermundane in the methods or agencies employed in healing the sick by mental processes. And thirdly, no power or agency, mundane or supermundane, extraneous to the patient himself, has any part or lot in the process of mental healing. For proof of these two propositions, we may again refer to the authority of the Master. And this brings us to the immediate consideration of the question what mental healing is. Those who are acquainted with the history and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, as set forth in the New Testament, will recall the facts that he never claimed any credit for healing the sick, nor did he arrogate to himself the possession of any personal power to heal disease, much less did he ascribe the power to any other agency, human or divine, extraneous to the patient himself. In truth, the reticence of Jesus in regard to his attributes and powers was one of his most marked characteristics. But more remarkable still was the fact that what he did say was always pregnant with veritable scientific significance. No better illustration of this can be imagined than his constantly reiterated statement with regard to the real source of the healing power manifested in his patients. The words, "Thy faith hath made thee whole," constitute a scientifically exact statement of the fundamental fact of mental therapeutics. Their obvious meaning is, first, that the power which effects the healing is resident within the patient, and not in any extraneous force or agency. This is the primary meaning of the phrase, and no amount of sophistry can weaken its force or significance. Secondly, it means that this force or energy resident within the patient consists of, or is due to, a certain definite mental condition or attitude of mind with reference to the work to be done. It may be here remarked that the English word faith very inadequately describes the energy or force in question, as Jesus apparently understood it. That is to say, no definition of the word is found in any dictionary that conveys the slightest notion of that dynamic energy which enabled the leper to throw off his disease instantaneously, or the lame man to take up his bed and walk. Every dictionary definition embraces the implication of some form or degree of belief as its determinative feature. But the faith which Jesus proclaimed as the one prepotent agency in the healing of disease, the faith which sustained Peter in his walk upon the water until he momentarily lost it, the dynamic potentialities of which could only be adequately prefigured as being equal to the removal of mountains, such a faith is necessarily far more than the word belief or confidence would imply. It includes both, as modern experiments amply demonstrate, but it must also include all the spiritual energies of the human soul. To say the least, it must be the mental condition precedent to enable the soul to exercise any of its powers. Be that as it may, it is sufficient for present purposes to know that faith is the essential mental condition prerequisite to success in healing the sick by any process of mental healing. And when Jesus of Nazareth proclaimed that pregnant fact, he anticipated the inductions of modern science by 1900 years. How he came into possession of such an exact knowledge of the fundamental law of mental healing is not a pertinent subject of discussion in this connection. It is sufficient to note the fact that he possessed that knowledge. Science is concerned only with the question of verification. That it has been amply verified by scientific experimentation within the last quarter of a century is a matter of common knowledge among students of experimental psychology. The nature of the experiments and their evidential value will be shown hereinafter. In the meantime, we must assume provisionally that a certain definite attitude of mind on the part of the patient is essential to success in mental healing, and that attitude of mind is best defined by the word faith. It is also an evidence that, When faith is perfect, methods of healing are of comparatively little importance. That is to say, methods may vary within very wide limits without affecting the result, provided each patient is inspired by the requisite confidence in the particular method employed in his case. Hence the frequent successes attending each of the innumerable methods of mental healing that have prevailed in all the ages of mankind. We have now definitely ascertained the one fundamental fact that correlates all forms, methods, and systems of mental healing. That is, we know the mental condition that must be induced in all cases and under all systems before mental healing becomes possible. We know that even the master could not dispense with those conditions, for, we are told, he could not do many wonderful works among the people of his own village because of their unbelief. It follows that the essential thing for the healer to know is how to induce that condition in his patients. Indeed, it may be said that the whole art of mental healing consists in knowing how best to control the patient's mind in that direction. Of course, there are as many ways of doing it as there are mental healers, and they are all more or less effective, as I have already stated. This is not, however, the place to discuss the various methods in vogue. My present purpose is to point out the underlying psychological principles involved in all methods, and incidentally to show that when those principles are once comprehended, the law of mental medicine will be found to be, like all of nature's laws, simple to the last degree, and far removed from the realms of mysticism and superstition. That, for instance, which is of primary importance, namely, the induction of the essential condition of faith in the mind of the patient, will be found to be surprisingly easy of accomplishment. At the outset, I owe an apology to many of my readers for that I shall be compelled, in this chapter, to repeat the substance of much that has been already set forth more at length in my former works. This becomes necessary for the reason that the arguments in this book will be based upon the working hypothesis formulated in my first work, and although that hypothesis is now very generally accepted by scientists, it will doubtless be new to many lay readers of this treatise. In order, therefore, to make the argument comprehensible by all, its steps must be taken in orderly sequence, beginning with the fundamental psychological principles involved. These may be stated in two propositions, namely, 1. Man is endowed with a dual mind, or two states of consciousness. For convenience of treatment, and to make distinctions clear and readily comprehensible, I prefer to assume that man is endowed with two minds. As a working hypothesis, I am logically justified in this assumption, for the reason that everything happens just as though it were true. This fact is easily demonstrable by the processes of experimental psychology, and it is now very generally recognized by all students of psychic science. I have chosen to designate one of the two minds as the objective mind and the other as the subjective mind, and they will be so differentiated throughout this treatise. Others have adopted other terms of differentiation, such as the conscious and the unconscious, the conscious and the subconscious minds, each of which is an obvious misnomer. The savants of the Society for Psychical Research generally designate the two states of consciousness as the supraliminal and the subliminal / after the old psychologists. I have adopted the terms objective and subjective for the simple reason that the objective mind is the mind of ordinary waking consciousness, which takes cognizance of the objective world by means of the 5 objective senses. Whereas the subjective mind is that intelligence which manifests itself in all subjective states and conditions, as in hypnotism, somnambulism, trance, dreams, etc. When the objective senses are asleep or are otherwise wholly or partially inhibited. 2. The second proposition is that the subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion. The term suggestion, as defined by hypnotists, signifies the insinuation of a belief or impulse into the mind of a subject by any means, as by words or gestures, usually by emphatic declaration. Century Dictionary. This definition is correct as far as it goes, but it is far from indicating the full scope and significance of the law of suggestion. It is not, as is indicated by the above definition, restricted to hypnotized subjects, nor to any other mental state or condition, normal or abnormal. It is a universal law of the subjective mind. The supposition that it is restricted to hypnotized subjects arose from the fact that its discoverers were studying the phenomena of hypnotism exclusively, and hence had no data for a broader generalization. It was, nevertheless, an immense stride in advance, for it threw a flood of light upon much that was mysterious in the phenomena of hypnotism. Its chief value, however, consisted in that it paved the way for the broader discovery that it is a universal law of the subjective mind. The latter discovery was the inevitable consequence of the formulation of the doctrine of mental duality, for, it was reasoned, if man is endowed with two minds, there must necessarily be some clear line of differentiation between them, both as to their powers and their limitations. It was at length seen that suggestion and its corollaries furnished the clue to the situation. Thus, one of the corollaries of the law of suggestion is that the subjective mind is incapable of inductive reasoning, that is to say, it is incapable of instituting and conducting independently a line of research by collecting facts, classifying them, and estimating their relative evidential values. On the contrary, it is compelled, by the primary law of its being, to accept its premises from extraneous sources, that is to say, whatever suggestions are imparted to it constitute the premises from which it reasons. It follows that its method of reasoning is purely deductive, and it is here that one of its marvelous powers is made manifest, for its power of correct deduction is well nigh perfect. And this is true whether the premise is true or false. That is to say, its deductions from a false premise are as logically correct as from a true one. And, moreover, false and true suggestions are alike carried into active effect wherever it is possible. Thus, if it is suggested to a hypnotized subject that he is a dog, he will instantaneously assume the attitude and perform the acts of a dog, so far as it is physically possible to do so, firmly believing himself to be a dog. In a word, any character suggested, be it a fool or a philosopher, an angel or a devil, an orator or an auctioneer, will be personified with marvelous fidelity to the original, just so far as the subject's knowledge of the original extends. The wonderful histrionic ability displayed by hypnotized subjects in personating suggested characters has often been remarked. But it is not acting a part in the ordinary sense of the word. It is much more than acting, for the subject believes himself to be the actual personality suggested. It is not, therefore, a question of histrionic talent in the ordinary sense, for subjects who are entirely destitute of that ability will personate to perfection any suggested character with which they are familiar. It is a common observation that excellence in the histrionic art is proportioned in each case to the actor's ability to forget his own personality and to identify himself with that of the character which he seeks to portray. It is, therefore, obvious that the whole secret of the so-called histrionic ability of the hypnotic subject is accounted for by the fact that his own personality is completely submerged under the influence of suggestion. His identification with the suggested personality is also complete, for he believes himself to be the actual person suggested. The essential prerequisite mental conditions of good acting are, therefore, present in perfection. It follows that in proportion to the subject's knowledge and intelligent appreciation of the salient characteristics of the suggested personality, will the rendition approach perfection. It is scarcely necessary to remark that a stevedore cannot be suddenly transformed into a good actor, in the theatrical sense, by means of hypnotism. Knowledge of the salient characteristics of an individual is one thing, and knowledge of the requirements of the stage is quite another. The principle, however, is the same. It follows that an actor who has intelligently studied his part and knows its requirements, but is deficient in the power of rendition, could be trained to a high state of efficiency in the histrionic art by means of hypnotic suggestion. It would, of course, require a trainer of high character and exceptional intelligence to achieve the best results. I mention these hypnotic experiments for the purpose of showing how perfectly the subjective mind is dominated by the power of suggestion. Whether true or false, a suggestion yields a potent influence, although there are necessarily degrees of potency depending upon conditions, just as there are degrees of potency under varying conditions in every force in nature. And, like every other force in nature, suggestion acts most effectively on lines of least resistance. Thus, a suggestion that is contrary to the moral principles of the subject will be resisted with a strength and persistence proportioned to its moral obliquity. A suggestion the performance of which one since the above was written, Dr. John Duncan Wikinbos, Emeritus Professor of Psychology in Columbia University, read a paper before the Medico-Legal Society of New York on this subject, which has since been published in the Medico-Legal Journal. The doctor is one of the leading hypnotists in this country, and he reports some marvelous successes in training actors for the stage. Professor A. E. Carpenter of Boston has also been highly successful in training subjects for the lecture platform. Would render the subject an object of ridicule will be resisted by him with an emphasis proportioned to his pride and dignity. A suggestion that would imperil the life of the subject if carried into execution will be resisted with an energy proportioned to the degree and imminence of the peril involved. These do not constitute exceptions to the law of suggestion. On the contrary, they serve to illustrate its universality. For, be it remembered, an autosuggestion is just as potent, other things being equal, as a suggestion from another person, and when the subjective mind is confronted by two opposing suggestions, the stronger one necessarily prevails. Thus, the settled moral principles of the subject's life will successfully resist the suggestions of crime or immorality, for moral principles constitute autosuggestions, the strength of which is proportioned to that of his moral character. The subject's dignity of character, in like manner, constitutes an autosuggestion that may successfully resist a suggestion the active acceptance of which would place him in a ridiculous attitude, and the instinct of self-preservation will, on the same principle, cause him to refuse to imperil his life. There are, in fact, an infinite number of conditions which tend more or less strongly to modify or divert the force of the suggestions which find lodgment in the subjective mind of man. Thus, a suggestion that is known by the subject in his normal condition to be absolutely false will always excite at least a momentary opposition, and that, too, will be duly proportioned to the enormity of the falsehood. In matters of indifference to him, he may be induced, by persistence and iteration, to accept and act upon it, or where the performance of the act suggested promises to result in a decided advantage to himself, he may accept it with alacrity. In any event, when a suggestion is once accepted and followed by corresponding action, its falsity and its incongruities are soon lost sight of by the subject, and, to all its possible intents and purposes, it becomes a reality to his subjective mind, and it is followed by all its consequences, within the limits of physical possibility. Practical illustrations of this are often seen in certain systems of mental therapeutics, where the patient is told that if he will consent to believe certain things that he knows to be untrue and to the last degree absurd and impossible, his faith will be speedily followed by restored health. Resistance to such a suggestion is, of course, instantaneous, and it is prolonged in proportion to the patient's intelligence. Nevertheless, many marvelous cures have resulted under suggestions that to the alienist clearly reveal their origin in a pathological condition of the mind of their inventor. It will now be seen that the effectiveness of suggestions is not dependent upon the induction of the hypnotic condition, for under the system to which allusion has been made, that condition is never induced, that is, in the sense in which hypnosis is commonly understood. That is to say, the condition of hypnotic sleep is never induced. Passivity of mind and body is all that is required of the patients, which, as we shall see later on, is the equivalent of hypnosis for therapeutic purposes. The points to be observed and remembered in connection with the foregoing are the following. 1. The subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by suggestion without reference to the state or condition of the objective mind. 2. Suggestions operate most effectively on lines of least resistance. 3. Resistance to suggestions from extraneous sources arises from autosuggestions having their origin in various emotions, such as the primordial instincts, as of self-preservation, love of offspring, etc., settled moral principles, sensitiveness to ridicule, fixed habits of thought, or love of scientific truth. This includes resistance to suggestions which are an obvious contravention of reason, experience, or the evidence of the senses. 4. Resistance to the last-named suggestions is proportioned to the intelligence of the subject, and hence it is often overcome by persistence, especially when accompanied by promises of resultant benefits, as in certain methods of mental healing. It follows that while the faith that is required to make therapeutic suggestions effective is primarily the faith of the subjective mind, nevertheless suggestions are most potent when they are not antagonized by any resistance whatever, either intellectual or emotional. Hence it is that suggestions which are based upon scientific truth, other things being equal, are necessarily the most potent in their influence and permanent in their effects. As in all the other relations of human life, truth is mightier than error or falsehood, and it is the condition precedent to all permanent good. Having now briefly outlined the salient points pertaining to the first two fundamental psychological propositions, it remains to add a third term to complete a working hypothesis for the systematic study of mental medicine. The third term, or proposition, therefore, is that the subjective mind is the power that controls the functions, sensations, and conditions of the body. I need not dwell at length upon this proposition here, as its truth will more fully appear as we proceed in subsequent chapters. No scientist will deny the existence within us of a central intelligence which controls the bodily functions, and, through the sympathetic nervous system, actuates the involuntary muscles and keeps the bodily machinery in motion. Nor will the most pronounced materialist deny that this central intelligence is the controlling energy which regulates the action of each of the myriad cellular entities of which the whole body is composed. It matters not how we may designate it, or what our theories may be as to its origin and destiny. It exists. Whether we call it the principle of life, the abdominal brain, the communal soul, the subliminal consciousness, or the subjective mind, it exists, and it controls the bodily functions in health and disease, and, in turn, is controllable by the subtle power of suggestion. We have, then, in three propositions, each of which is demonstrable by experimentation, a complete working hypothesis for the systematic study and practice of mental therapeutics. They may be restated and grouped in systematic order as follows. 1. Man is endowed with a dual mind, objective and subjective. 2. The subjective mind controls the functions, sensations, and conditions of the body. 3. The subjective mind is amenable to control by suggestion.